Section 13 of A Little Tour in France by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I had been twice at Avignon before, and yet I was not satisfied. I probably am satisfied now. Nevertheless, I enjoyed my third visit. I shall not soon forget the first, on which a particular emotion set an indelible stamp. I was travelling northward in 1870, after 4 months spent for the first time in Italy. It was the middle of January, and I had found myself unexpectedly forced to return to England for the rest of the winter. It was an insufferable disappointment. I was wretched and broken-hearted. Italy appeared to me at that time so much better than anything else in the world, that to rise from table in the middle of the feast was a prospect of being hungry for the rest of my days. I had heard a great deal of praise of the south of France, but the south of France was a poor consolation. In this state of mind I arrived at Avignon, which, under a bright, hard winter sun, was tingling, fairly spinning, with the Mistral. I find in my journal of the other day a reference to the acuteness of my reluctance in January 1870. France, after Italy, appeared, in the language of the latter country, poco simpatica, and I thought it necessary, for reasons now inconceivable, to read the Figaro, which was filled with descriptions of the horrible Troppmann, the murderer of the famille Kink. Troppmann, Kink, le crime de Pantin, very names that figured in this episode seemed to wave me back. Had I abandoned the sonorous south to associate with vocables so base? It was very cold the other day at Avignon, for though there was no Mistral, it was raining as it rains in Provence, and the dampness has a terrible chill in it. As I sat by my fire late at night, for in genial Avignon in October I had to have a fire, it came back to me that 11 years before I had at that same hour sat by a fire in that same room, and, writing to a friend to whom I was not afraid to appear extravagant, had made a vow that at some happier period of the future I would avenge myself on the ci devant city of the popes by taking it in a contrary sense. I suppose that I redeemed my vow on the occasion of my second visit better than on my third, for then I was on my way to Italy, and that vengeance, of course, was complete. The only drawback was that I was in such a hurry to get to Ventimiglia, where the Italian custom house was to be the sign of my triumph, that I scarcely took time to make it clear to myself at Avignon that this was better than reading the Figaro. I hurried on almost too fast to enjoy the consciousness of moving southward. On this last occasion I was unfortunately destitute of that happy faith. Avignon was my southernmost limit, after which I was to turn round and proceed back to England. But in the interval I had been a great deal in Italy, and that made all the difference. I had plenty of time to think of this, for the rain kept me practically housed for the first 24 hours. It had been raining in these regions for a month, and people had begun to look askance at the Rhone, though as yet the volume of the river was not exorbitant. The only excursion possible, while the torrent descended, was a kind of horizontal dive, accompanied with infinite splashing, to the little musee of the town, which is within a moderate walk of the hotel. I had a memory of it from my first visit. It had appeared to me more pictorial than its pictures. I found that recollection had flattered it a little, and that it is neither better nor worse than most provincial museums. It has the usual musty chill in the air, the usual grass-grown forecourt in which a few lumpish Roman fragments are disposed, the usual red tiles on the floor, and the usual specimens of the more livid schools on the walls. I rang up the gardien, who arrived with a bunch of keys, wiping his mouth. He unlocked the doors for me, opened shutters, and while, to my distress, as if the things had been worth lingering over, he shuffled about after me, he announced the names of the pictures before which I stopped, in a voice that reverberated through the melancholy halls, and seemed to make the authorship shameful when it was obscure, and grotesque when it pretended to be great. Then there were intervals of silence, while I stared absent-mindedly at haphazard, at some indistinguishable canvas, and the only sound was the downpour of the rain on the skylights. The Museum of Avignon derives a certain dignity from its Roman fragments. The town has no Roman monuments to show. In this respect, beside its brilliant neighbors, Arles and Nimes, it is a blank. But a great many small objects have been found in its soil: pottery, glass, bronzes, lamps, vessels and ornaments of gold and silver. The glass is especially charming. Small vessels of the most delicate shape and substance, many of them perfectly preserved. These diminutive, intimate things bring one near to the old Roman life. They seem like pearls strung upon the slender thread that swings across the gulf of time. A little glass cup that Roman lips have touched says more to us than the great vessel of an arena. There are two small casseroles, with chiselled handles, in the Museum of Avignon, that struck me as among the most charming survivals of antiquity. I did wrong just above to speak of my attack on this establishment as the only recreation I took that first wet day; for I remember a terribly moist visit to the former palace of the popes, which could have taken place only in the same tempestuous hours. It is true that I scarcely know why I should have gone to see the papal palace in the rain, for I had been over it twice before, and even then had not found the interest of the place so complete as it ought to be. The fact nevertheless remains that this last occasion is much associated with an umbrella, which was not superfluous even in some of the chambers and corridors of the gigantic pile. It had already seemed to me the dreariest of all historical buildings, and my final visit confirmed the impression. The place is as intricate as it is vast, and as desolate as it is dirty. The imagination has, for some reason or other, to make more than the effort usual in such cases to restore and repeople it. The fact, indeed, is simply that the palace has been so incalculably abused and altered. The alterations have been so numerous that though I have duly conned the enumerations supplied in guide books of the principal perversions, I do not pretend to carry any of them in my head. The huge bare mass, without ornament, without grace, despoiled of its battlements, and defaced with sordid modern windows, covering the Rocher des Doms, and looking down over the Rhone and the broken bridge of Saint Benazet, which stops in such a sketchable manner in mid-stream, and across at the lonely tower of Philippe le Bel and the ruined wall of Villeneuve, makes at a distance, in spite of its poverty, a great figure, the effect of which is carried out by the tower of the church beside it, crowned though the latter be, in a top-heavy fashion, with an immense modern image of the Virgin, and by the thick, dark foliage of the garden laid out on a still higher portion of the eminence. This garden recalls, faintly and a trifle perversely, the grounds of the Pincian at Rome. I know not whether it is the shadow of the papal name, present in both places, combined with a vague analogy between the churches, which, approached in each case by a flight of steps, seems to defend the precinct, but each time I have seen the Promenade des Doms it has carried my thoughts to the wider and loftier terrace from which you look away at the Tiber and St. Peter's. As you stand before the papal palace, and especially as you enter it, you are struck with its being a very dull monument. History enough was enacted here. The great schism lasted from 1305 to 1370, during which 7 popes, all Frenchmen, carried on the court of Avignon on principles that have not commended themselves to the esteem of posterity. But history has been whitewashed away, and the scandals of that period have mingled with the dust of dilapidations and repairs. The building has for many years been occupied as a barrack for regiments of the line, and the main characteristic of a barrack, an extreme nudity and a very queer smell, prevailed throughout its endless compartments. Nothing could have been more cruelly dismal than the appearance it presented at the time of this third visit of mine. A regiment, changing quarters, had departed the day before, and another was expected to arrive, from Algeria, on the morrow. The place had been left in the befouled and belittered condition which marks the passage of the military after they have broken camp, and it would offer but a melancholy welcome to the regiment that was about to take possession. Enormous windows had been left carelessly open all over the building, and the rain and wind were beating into empty rooms and passages, making draughts which purified perhaps, but which scarcely cheered. For an arrival it was horrible. A handful of soldiers had remained behind. In one of the big vaulted rooms several of them were lying on their wretched beds in the dim light, in the cold, in the damp, with the bleak bare walls before them, and their overcoats spread over them, pulled up to their noses. I pitied them immensely, though they may have felt less wretched than they looked. I thought not of the old profligacies and crimes, not of the funnel-shaped torture chamber, which, after exciting the shudder of generations, has been ascertained now, I believe, to have been a mediaeval bakehouse; not of the tower of the Glaciere and the horrors perpetrated here in the Revolution, but of the military burden of young France. One wonders how young France endures it, and one is forced to believe that the French conscript has, in addition to his notorious good humor, greater toughness than is commonly supposed by those who consider only the more relaxing influences of French civilization. I hope he finds occasional compensations for such moments as I saw those damp young peasants passing on the mattresses of their hideous barrack, without anything to remind them that they were in the most civilized of countries. The only traces of former splendor now visible in the papal pile are the walls and vaults of two small chapels, painted in fresco, so battered and effaced as to be scarcely distinguishable by Simone Memmi. It offers, of course, a peculiarly good field for restoration, and I believe the government intend to take it in hand. I mention this fact without a sigh, for they cannot well make it less interesting than it is at present. Fortunately, it did not rain every day, though I believe it was raining everywhere else in the department. Otherwise I should not have been able to go to Villeneuve and to Vaucluse. The afternoon, indeed, was lovely when I walked over the interminable bridge that spans the two arms of the Rhone, divided here by a considerable island, and directed my course, like a solitary horseman, on foot, to the lonely tower which forms one of the outworks of Villeneuve-les-Avignon. The picturesque, half-deserted little town lies a couple of miles further up the river. The immense round towers of its old citadel and the long stretches of ruined wall covering the slope on which it lies are the most striking features of the nearer view as you look from Avignon across the Rhone. I spent a couple of hours in visiting these objects, and there was a kind of pictorial sweetness in the episode, but I have not many details to relate. The isolated tower I just mentioned has much in common with the detached dungeon of Montmajour, which I had looked at in going to Les Baux, and to which I paid my respects in speaking of that excursion. Also the work of Philippe le Bel, built in 1307, it is amazingly big and stubborn, and formed the opposite limit of the broken bridge, whose first arches, on the side of Avignon, alone remain to give a measure of the occasional volume of the Rhone. Half an hour's walk brought me to Villeneuve, which lies away from the river, looking like a big village, half depopulated, and occupied for the most part by dogs and cats, old women and small children, these last in general remarkably pretty, in the manner of the children of Provence. You pass through the place, which seems in a singular degree vague and unconscious, and come to the rounded hill on which the ruined abbey lifts its yellow walls, the Benedictine abbey of Saint Andre, at once a church, a monastery, and a fortress. A large part of the crumbling enceinte disposes itself over the hill, but for the rest all that has preserved any traceable cohesion is a considerable portion of the citadel. The defence of the place appears to have been entrusted largely to the huge round towers that flank the old gate, one of which, the more complete, the ancient warden, having first inducted me into his own dusky little apartment and presented me with a great bunch of lavender, enabled me to examine in detail. I would almost have dispensed with the privilege, for I think I have already mentioned that an acquaintance with many feudal interiors has wrought a sad confusion in my mind. The image of the outside always remains distinct. I keep it apart from other images of the same sort. It makes a picture sufficiently ineffaceable. But the guard rooms, winding staircases, loopholes, prisons, repeat themselves and intermingle. They have a wearisome family likeness. There are always black passages and corners, and walls 20 feet thick, and there is always some high place to climb up to for the sake of a magnificent view. The views, too, are apt to get muddled. These dense gate towers of Philippe le Bel struck me, however, as peculiarly wicked and grim. Their capacity is of the largest, and they contain over so many devilish little dungeons, lighted by the narrowest slit in the prodigious wall, where it comes over one with a good deal of vividness, and still more horror, that wretched human beings ever lay there rotting in the dark. The dungeons of Villeneuve made a particular impression on me, greater than any except those of Loches, which must certainly be the most gruesome in Europe. I hasten to add that every dark hole at Villeneuve is called the dungeon, and I believe it is well established that in this manner, in almost all old castles and towers, the sensibilities of the modern tourist are unscrupulously played upon. There were plenty of black holes in the Middle Ages that were not dungeons, but household receptacles of various kinds, and many a tear dropped in pity for the groaning captive has really been addressed to the spirits of the larder and the faggot nook. For all this, there are some very bad corners in the towers of Villeneuve, so that I was not wide of the mark when I began to think again, as I had often thought before, of the stoutness of the human composition in the Middle Ages, and the tranquillity of nerve of people to whom the groaning captive and the blackness of a living tomb were familiar ideas which did not at all interfere with their happiness or their sanity. Our modern nerves, our irritable sympathies, our easy discomforts and fears make one think, in some relations, less respectfully of human nature. Unless, indeed, it be true, as I have heard it maintained, that in the Middle Ages every one did go mad, every one was mad. The theory that this was a period of general insanity is not altogether indefensible. Within the old walls of its immense abbey, the town of Villeneuve has built itself a rough faubourg, the fragments with which the soil was covered having been, I suppose, a quarry of material. There are no streets; the small shabby houses, almost hovels, straggle at random over the uneven ground. The only important feature is a convent of cloistered nuns, who have a large garden, always within the walls, behind their house, and whose doleful establishment you look down into, or down at simply, from the battlements of the citadel. One or two of the nuns were passing in and out of the house. They wore grey robes with a bright red cape. I thought their situation most provincial. I came away and wandered a little over the base of the hill, outside the walls. Small white stones cropped through the grass, over which low olive trees were scattered. The afternoon had a yellow brightness. I sat down under one of the little trees, on the grass, the delicate grey branches were not much above my head, and rested, and looked at Avignon across the Rhone. It was very soft, very still and pleasant, though I am not sure it was all I once should have expected of that combination of elements, an old city wall for a background, a canopy of olives, and, for a couch, the soil of Provence. When I came back to Avignon the twilight was already thick, but I walked up to the Rocher des Doms. Here again I had the benefit of that amiable moon which had already lighted up for me so many romantic scenes. She was full, and she rose over the Rhone, and made it look in the distance like a silver serpent. I remember saying to myself at this moment that it would be a beautiful evening to walk round the walls of Avignon, the remarkable walls which challenge comparison with those of Carcassonne and Aigues Mortes, and which it was my duty, as an observer of the picturesque, to examine with some attention. Presenting themselves to that silver sheen, they could not fail to be impressive. So, at least, I said to myself, but unfortunately I did not believe what I said. It is a melancholy fact that the walls of Avignon have never impressed me at all, and I have never taken the trouble to make the circuit. They are continuous and complete, but for some mysterious reason they fail of their effect. This is partly because they are very low, in some places almost absurdly so, being buried in new accumulations of soil and by the filling in of the moat up to their middle. Then they have been too well tended. They not only look at present very new, but look as if they had never been old. The fact that their extent is very much greater makes them more of a curiosity than those of Carcassonne, but this is exactly at the same time what is fatal to their pictorial unity. With their 37 towers and 7 gates, they lose themselves too much to make a picture that will compare with the admirable little vignette of Carcassonne. I may mention, now that I am speaking of the general mass of Avignon, that nothing is more curious than the way in which, viewed from a distance, it is all reduced to naught by the vast bulk of the Palace of the Popes. From across the Rhone, or from the train as you leave the place, this great grey block is all Avignon. It seems to occupy the whole city, extensive with its shrunken population as the city is. Chapter 35. It was the morning after this, I think, a certain Saturday, that when I came out of the Hôtel de l'Europe, which lies in a shallow concavity just within the city gate that opens on the Rhone, came out to look at the sky from the little place before the inn, and see how the weather promised for the obligatory excursion to Vaucluse, I found the whole town in a terrible taking. I say the whole town advisedly, for every inhabitant appeared to have taken up a position on the bank of the river, or on the uppermost parts of the promenade of the Dôme, where a view of its course was to be obtained. It had risen surprisingly in the night, and the good people of Avignon had reason to know what a rise of the Rhone might signify. The town, in its lower portions, is quite at the mercy of the swollen waters, and it was mentioned to me that in 1856 the Hôtel de l'Europe, with its convenient hollow, was flooded up to within a few feet of the ceiling of the dining room, where the long board which had served for so many a table d'hôte floated disreputably with its legs in the air. On the present occasion the mountains of the Ardèche, where it had been raining for a month, had sent down torrents which all that fine Friday night, by the light of the innocent-looking moon, poured themselves into the Rhone and its tributary, the Durance. The river was enormous and continued to rise, and the sight was beautiful and horrible. The water in many places was already at the base of the city walls, the quay, with its parapet just emerging, being already covered. The country, seen from the Plateau des Doms, resembled a vast lake with protrusions of trees, houses, bridges, gates. The people looked at it in silence, as I had seen people before, on the occasion of a rise of the Arno at Pisa, appear to consider the prospects of an inundation. Il monte toujours. There was not much said but that. It was a general holiday, and there was an air of wishing to profit, for sociability's sake, by any interruption of the commonplace. The popular mind likes a change, and the element of change mitigates the sense of disaster. But the affair was not otherwise a holiday. Suspense and anxiety were in the air, and it never is pleasant to be reminded of the helplessness of man. In the presence of a loosened river, with its ravaging, unconquerable volume, this impression is as strong as possible. And as I looked at the deluge which threatened to make an island of the papal palace, I perceived that the scourge of water is greater than the scourge of fire. A blaze may be quenched, but where could the flame be kindled that would arrest the quadrupled Rhone? For the population of Avignon a good deal was at stake, and I am almost ashamed to confess that in the midst of the public alarm I considered the situation from the point of view of the little projects of a sentimental tourist. Would the prospective inundation interfere with my visit to Vaucluse, or make it imprudent to linger 24 hours longer at Avignon? I must add that the tourist was not perhaps, after all, so sentimental. I have spoken of the pilgrimage to the shrine of Petrarch as obligatory, and that was in fact the light in which it presented itself to me, all the more that I had been twice at Avignon without undertaking it. This is why I was vexed at the Rhone, if vexed I was, for representing as impracticable an excursion which I cared nothing about. How little I cared was manifest from my inaction on former occasions. I had a prejudice against Vaucluse, against Petrarch, even against the incomparable Laura. I was sure that the place was cockneyfied and threadbare, and I had never been able to take an interest in the poet and the lady. I was sure that I had known many women, as charming and as handsome as she, about whom much less noise had been made, and I was convinced that her singer was factitious and literary, and that there are half a dozen stanzas in Wordsworth that speak more to the soul than the whole collection of his fioriture. This was the crude state of mind in which I was determined to go, at any risk, to Vaucluse. Now that I think it over, I seem to remember that I had hoped, after all, that the submersion of the roads would forbid it. Since morning the clouds had gathered again, and by noon they were so heavy that there was every prospect of a torrent. It appeared absurd to choose such a time as this to visit a fountain which would be indistinguishable in the general cataract. Nevertheless, I took a vow that if at noon the rain should not have begun to descend upon Avignon, I would repair to the head spring of the Sorgue. When the critical moment arrived, the clouds were hanging over Avignon like distended water bags, which only needed a prick to empty themselves. The prick was not given, however. All nature was too much occupied in following the aberration of the Rhone to think of playing tricks elsewhere. Accordingly, I started for the station in a spirit which, for a tourist who sometimes had prided himself on his unfailing supply of sentiment, was shockingly perfunctory. For tasks and hours of insight willed may be in hours of gloom fulfilled. I remembered these lines of Matthew Arnold, written apparently in an hour of gloom, and carried out the idea, as I went by hoping that with the return of insight I should be glad to have seen Vaucluse. Light has descended upon me since then, and I declare that the excursion is in every way to be recommended. The place makes a great impression, quite apart from Petrarch and Laura. There was no rain. There was only, all the afternoon, a mild, moist wind and a sky magnificently black, which made a repoussoir for the paler cliffs of the fountain. The road, by train, crosses a flat, expressionless country, toward the range of arid hills which lie to the east of Avignon, and which spring, says Murray, from the mass of the Mont Ventoux. At Isle-sur-Sorgue, at the end of about an hour, the foreground becomes much more animated, and the distance much more, or perhaps I should say much less, actual. I descended from the train and ascended to the top of an omnibus, which was to convey me into the recesses of the hills. It had not been among my provisions that I should be indebted to a vehicle of that kind for an opportunity to commune with the spirit of Petrarch, and I had to borrow what consolation I could from the fact that at least I had the omnibus to myself. I was the only passenger. Every one else was at Avignon watching the Rhone. I lost no time in perceiving that I could not have come to Vaucluse at a better moment. The Sorgue was almost as full as the Rhone, and of a colour much more romantic. Rushing along its narrow channel under an avenue of fine platanes, it is confined between solid little embankments of stone, with the good wives of the village on the brink washing their linen in its contemptuous flood. It gave promise of high entertainment further on. The drive to Vaucluse is of about 3/4 of an hour, and though the river, as I say, was promising, the big pale hills, as the road winds into them, did not look as if their slopes of stone and shrub were a nestling place for superior scenery. It is a part of the merit of Vaucluse, indeed, that it is as much as possible a surprise. The place has a right to its name, for the valley appears impenetrable until you get fairly into it. One perverse twist follows another, until the omnibus suddenly deposits you in front of the cabinet of Petrarch. After that you have only to walk along the left bank of the river. The cabinet of Petrarch is to-day a hideous little cafe, bedizened, like a signboard, with extracts from the ingenious Rime. The poet and his lady are, of course, the stock in trade of this little village, which has had for several generations the privilege of attracting young couples engaged in their wedding tour, and other votaries of the tender passion. The place has long been familiar on festal Sundays to the swains of Avignon and their attendant nymphs. The little fish of the Sorgue are much esteemed, and, eaten on the spot, they constitute, for the children of the once papal city, the classic suburban dinner. Vaucluse has been turned to account, however, not only by sentiment but by industry, the banks of the stream being disfigured by a pair of hideous mills for the manufacture of paper and of wool. In an enterprising and economical age the water power of the Sorgue was too obvious a motive, and I must say that as the torrent rushed past them, the wheels of the dirty little factories appeared to turn merrily enough. The foot-bank on the left bank, of which I just spoke, carries one fortunately quite out of sight of them, and out of sound as well, inasmuch as on the day of my visit the stream itself, which was in tremendous force, tended more and more, as one approached the fountain, to fill the valley with its own echoes. Its colour was magnificent, and the whole spectacle more like a corner of Switzerland than a nook in Provence. The protrusions of the mountains shut it in, and you penetrate to the bottom of the recess which they form. The Sorgue rushes and rushes. It is almost like Niagara after the jump of the cataract. There are dreadful little booths beside the path, for the sale of photographs and immortelles (I don't know what one is to do with the immortelles), where you are offered a brush dipped in tar to write your name withal on the rocks. Thousands of vulgar persons of both sexes, and exclusively, it appeared, of the French nationality, had availed themselves of this implement, for every square inch of accessible stone was scored over with some human appellation. It is not only we in America, therefore, who besmirch our scenery. The practice exists, in a more organized form, like everything else in France, in the country of good taste. You leave the little booths and stalls behind, but the bescribbled crag, bristling with human vanity, keeps you company even when you stand face to face with the fountain. This happens when you find yourself at the foot of the enormous straight cliff out of which the river gushes. It rears itself to an extraordinary height, a huge forehead of bare stone, looking as if it were the half of a tremendous mound split open by volcanic action. The little valley, seeing it there at a bend, stops suddenly, and receives in its arms the magical spring. I call it magical on account of the mysterious manner in which it comes into the world, with the huge shoulder of the mountain rising over it, as if to protect the secret. From under the mountain it silently rises, without visible movement, filling a small natural basin with the stillest blue water. The contrast between the stillness of this basin and the agitation of the water directly after it has overflowed constitutes half the charm of Vaucluse. The violence of the stream, when once it has been set loose on the rocks, is as fascinating and indescribable as that of other cataracts. And the rocks in the bed of the Sorgue have been arranged by a master hand. The setting of the phenomenon struck me as so simple and so fine. The vast sad cliff, covered with the afternoon light, still and solid for ever, while the liquid element rages and roars at its base, that I had no difficulty in understanding the celebrity of Vaucluse. I understood it, but I will not say that I understood Petrarch. He must have been very self-supporting, and Madonna Laura must indeed have been much to him. The aridity of the hills that shut in the valley is complete, and the whole impression is best conveyed by that very expressive French epithet morne. There are the very fragmentary ruins of a castle of one of the bishops of Cavaillon, on a high spur of the mountain above the river, and there is another remnant of a feudal habitation on one of the more accessible ledges. Having half an hour to spare before my omnibus was to leave, I must beg the reader's pardon for this atrociously false note, call the vehicle a diligence, and for some undiscoverable reason the offence is minimized. I clambered up to this latter spot, and sat among the rocks in the company of a few stunted olives. The Sorgues beneath me, reaching the plain, flung itself crookedly across the meadows like an unrolled blue ribbon. I tried to think of the amant de l'or, for literature's sake, but I had no great success, and the most I could do was to say to myself that I must try again. Several months have elapsed since then, and I am ashamed to confess that the trial has not yet come off. The only very definite conviction I arrived at was that Vaucluse is indeed cocknified, but that I should have been a fool, all the same, not to come. End of section 13.